Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome back to the special series that I'm doing titled Under the Influence. And I'm not talking about, the drinking and drugging that we see a lot of times on body cams and other things that people are looking for. This, though, is very serious. This is being under the influence of another. When someone else can actually change the way your brain works. You think you'd never do something, but by the time they're done with you, you'll do it all day long. And you don't even think twice about it. That's some good manipulation. And there are some very shocking outcomes that this kind of manipulation can lead to. This is the Kimes case today, a mother's grip. So I'm sure you can start to think where this is going. This is the making of a criminal duo. All right. This case is twisted, and it's also terrifying. The people involved, Sante and Kenneth Kimes. Okay, so when I do this series, Under the Influence, we're not only talking about the crime here. For this story, for example, we're going to talk about how one person's toxic influence can turn another into an accomplice to murder. Sante Kimes didn't just raise her son. She groomed him. She groomed him to be a partner in crime, something she wanted. And in doing so, she created a deadly duo in them that left a trail of destruction in their wake. So let's start from the beginning and let's see how this mother-son relationship went from close to criminal. We're getting into the early years where this toxic bond begins. Sante Kimes, she was no ordinary mother. Born in Oklahoma in 1934, she herself came from a troubled background, and this would shape her into the manipulative and ruthless woman she would later become. Sante was driven by a desire for both wealth and power, like many. Yet she was different. She was willing to do whatever it took to achieve this goal. And that includes using her own son as a tool for her schemes. Kenneth Kimes, who was born in 1975, was Sante's youngest child. From a young age, Kenneth was exposed to his mother's criminal activities. Sante was involved in everything from petty theft to elaborate cons, and she made sure that Kenneth was right there beside her. To the outside world, they appeared to be a close-knit family, but beneath the surface, Sante was molding Kenneth into her perfect accomplice. What is particularly chilling about this case is how Sante used her influence over Kenneth. She didn't just teach him how to commit crimes, she made him believe that this was their way of life, that they were above the law. Kenneth grew up in a world where deception and manipulation were the norm. He never had the chance to develop a moral compass. He never knew anything else. Sante's control over him was absolute, and as he grew older, he became increasingly dependent on her approval and her guidance. So what was the grooming process here? What could it be that turned Kenneth into a partner in crime? And you have to remember, this is a child that has no view of the world and does not know anything but to trust his mother, right? So just keep that in mind. I mean, as Kenneth entered his teenage years, Sante's influence over him only deepened. She began involving him in more serious criminal activities like fraud and arson and theft. Kenneth, who had been conditioned to see his mother as an all-knowing authority figure, followed her lead without question. He was drawn deeper and deeper into her web of deceit, losing any sense of his own identity in the process. Sante was meticulous in her grooming of Kenneth. She isolated him from the outside world, ensuring that his only significant relationship would be with her. She convinced him that they were a team, that they could achieve anything together as long as they followed her plans. Kenneth, eager to please his mother, of course, and lacking any other guidance, became pretty much just an extension of her will. This grooming process was not just about teaching Kenneth how to commit crimes. This was about breaking down his sense of right and wrong. Sante blurred the lines between what was legal and illegal, what was moral and immoral, until Kenneth could not know the difference. He becomes a willing participant in her schemes, believing that they were invincible as long as they worked together. Nothing wrong here. All right, the first major crimes. Well, by the time Kenneth was in his early 20s, because this is still going on, he and Sante were operating at that time as a full-fledged criminal duo. They committed a series of frauds and cons across the whole country, targeting wealthy individuals and businesses. Their crimes became increasingly bold, and with each successful con, Sante's influence over Kenneth grew stronger. One of their major early crimes involved the theft of a mansion in the Bahamas. So they posed as wealthy socialites, and Sante and Kenneth, they managed to con their way into this property, forging documents and lying to authorities to take control of this estate. That's a big deal. Now, this crime showcased the extent of Sante's manipulation. She had not only convinced Kenneth to participate in this scheme, but had made him believe that they were actually entitled to this property. The success of just this one crime reinforced the toxic bond between mother and son. Kenneth's dependence on Sante deepened, and he became even more entangled in her criminal activities. The line between victim and accomplice now was becoming increasingly blurred, as Kenneth's actions were driven by his need for his mother's approval and his belief in their shared invincibility. So, all right, let's take a break. We have looked so far at the Kimes case. We've explored how Sante Kimes used her influence to turn her son Kenneth into a willing accomplice. So what began as a toxic bond between mom and son, it evolves into this dynamic criminal partnership, with Sante pulling the strings and Kenneth following her lead. But this is just the beginning. So take a break if you need it, get some water, get something, and come back, because I have the second part of this happening right now. Under the Influence, the Kimes case. All right, let's get into part 2. We're going to take a look at the most notorious crimes that these guys did together, the mother and son, crimes that escalated from fraud and theft to cold-blooded murder. The Kimes criminal activities reached a terrifying new level in 1998 when they committed their first known murder. Irene Silverman. This poor woman, she was a wealthy 82-year-old widow living in New York City. I mean, she'd made it, but she became their target. Sante and Kenneth, they posed as a mother and son looking to rent an apartment in Silverman's luxurious Manhattan townhouse. Their plan was to steal her property, steal her identity, of course, just like they'd done in the past. But this time, their scheme ended in murder. Sante, always the mastermind, had Kenneth carry out the physical act of killing Silverman. They drugged her, they smothered her, and then they disposed of her body, which was actually never found. The plan was as ruthless as it was cold, and it showed how deep Sante's control over Kenneth had become. He was now not just her accomplice in fraud, but a willing participant in murder. What is particularly chilling about this crime is how calculated it was. Sante had groomed Kenneth to the point where he no longer questioned her orders, even when it came to taking a life. The murder of Irene Silverman was a clear escalation in their criminal activities, and it marked the point where Kenneth's transformation from son to accomplice to murder was complete. After Silverman's murder, Sante and Kenneth continue their life of crime, leaving a trail of deception and destruction in their wake. They used Silverman's identity and forged documents, and they attempted to take control of her estate, just like they had done with other victims, but this time the authorities were closing in on them. Their downfall began when Silverman's disappearance was noticed by friends and neighbors, who alerted the police. Investigators quickly uncovered the Kimes' fraudulent documents and their activities and began to piece together the evidence linking them to Silverman's murder. Despite their attempts to cover their tracks, Sante and Kenneth had left behind this trail of clues, and that's exactly what would eventually lead to their capture. As this investigation progressed, more of the Kimes' crimes come into light. Authorities uncover a pattern of fraud and theft and deception that spanned decades and crossed state and national borders. But it was the murder of Irene Silverman that ultimately seals their fate. The evidence against them at that point was overwhelming, and the authorities were determined to bring them to justice. So, in June of 1998, Kenneth and Sante, they're arrested in New York City, bringing an end to their criminal spree. The arrest marked the culmination of years of manipulation, deception, and crime, all driven by Sante's toxic influence over her son. Now, for Kenneth, this arrest was the first time, he'd ever been separated from his mother's control. And it also marked the beginning of a long and difficult legal battle. This arrest was a media sensation, with the story of the mother and son criminal duo capturing the public's imagination. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of their crimes and the disturbing dynamics of their relationship. But the most shocking revelations were yet to come as the details of their manipulation, control, and violence emerged in court. The arrest of Sante and Kenneth Kimes marked the end of a criminal partnership that had spanned years and claimed multiple victims. But for Kenneth, it was also the end of a life lived under his mother's control. So the question now was whether he could escape her influence or whether he would remain under her grip, even as they faced justice for their crimes. During their trial, this is where the web of deception was really unraveled, okay? And it captured the attention of the entire nation, and everyone was just fascinated by the bizarre dynamics of their relationship. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture, a mother who manipulated her son from a young age. And this gets us into the final part 3 of all of this. What happened? Who's to blame here? So like I said, the prosecutors are painting this chilling picture, this mom who manipulated her son, indoctrinating him into a life of crime, and a son who is under her influence. He becomes a willing accomplice to murder. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution laid out the gruesome details of Irene Silverman's murder, alongside a laundry list of frauds and cons and thefts that were committed by this duo. Sante, always the mastermind, attempted to manipulate the courtroom just as she had manipulated her son. She portrayed herself as this loving mother, trying to protect her son, denying any of her involvement in the crimes. But the evidence, it was damning. Witnesses testified about Sante's cold and calculating nature and her powerful control over Kenneth. Even Kenneth's own testimony revealed the depth of his dependency on his mother and the psychological grip that she held over him. Despite her attempts to charm and mislead, Sante's lies begin to unravel. Kenneth, on the other hand, now he seemed lost without his mother's direction. In a rare moment of clarity, he admitted to being under her influence, but then he stopped short of taking full responsibility for his actions. He painted himself as a victim of his mother's control, a boy who never had the chance to think for himself. The defense team tried to use this narrative to help sway the jury. It was suggesting that Kenneth was as much a victim as the people they defrauded and murdered. However, the jury saw through this defense and recognized Kenneth's active participation in the crimes. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict came in. Both Sante and Kenneth Kimes were found guilty on multiple charges, including the murder of Irene Silverman. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the sentences. Sante Kimes received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Kenneth, who had shown some signs of remorse and was seen as having been heavily influenced by his mother, well, he was also sentenced to life. But he did have the possibility of parole, of course, after 125 years. It's really just life. For Kenneth, this sentencing was more than just a legal outcome. This was a moment of reckoning. So just picture yourself for the first time in your life like Kenneth, okay? Because he faced a future without his mother's control, without her constant influence guiding his every move. So while in prison, he begins to reflect on the life he had led, the crimes he committed, and the twisted bond that he had with his mother. The psychological scars ran deep, and rehabilitation seemed a distant possibility. But for the families of the victims, justice was served. Sante, ever defiant, maintained her innocence even though she was led away in handcuffs. She continued to try to manipulate and control. She refused to admit any guilt. She refused to accept the damage she had caused for so many lives, including that of her own son. All right, so can Kenneth, okay, if he is seen as a victim, can he ever break free? So Kenneth's time in prison, it's been marked by attempts to distance himself from his mother's influence, even in prison. Over the years, he has participated in psychological evaluations and counseling sessions, trying to make sense of a life that was overshadowed by manipulation. And there's nothing he can do about it now. I mean, the psychological damage inflicted by Sante was profound. Kenneth's identity, his morality, his autonomy, it all had been hijacked by her influence from a young age. I mean, he has never really lived his own life at all. For him, the question remains whether he can ever truly break free from the mental chains that she forged, or if he will remain in some way forever under her grip. As Kenneth continues to serve his sentence, his story is a tragic reminder of how deep the roots of manipulation can go and how hard it is to escape the influence of a toxic relationship, and especially one that forms during childhood by a parent. Kenneth's life behind bars is now one of reflection and reckoning. It's got to be hell, a search for an identity that was buried under his mother's overpowering will. I mean, he has to know he doesn't even know who he is. He didn't have the chance to know what he could have done. This Kimes case, it's more than just a story of a crime, like I said. It is the reminder of the devastating power of influence and manipulation. Sante's crimes, toxic, okay? She had a hold over her son. And this is just one of so many chilling examples of how one person can warp another's sense of reality, morality, and self. This case has been studied, and I'm sharing it with you if you didn't know about it, but this is a big deal. It's been studied by psychologists, criminologists, and legal experts who are trying to understand the dynamics of coercive control and how it can turn ordinary people into perpetrators of extraordinary crimes. For law enforcement and legal professionals, the Kimes case underscores the need to look beyond the surface in cases involving especially close familial relationships. It also raises important questions about culpability and victimhood, especially when one party is deeply under the psychological sway of another. In the end, the story of Sante and Kenneth, it's a cautionary tale of a bond turned toxic, a mother's grip that led to a legacy of crime and manipulation. We have seen by this how the wheels of justice turned. They turned against Sante and Kenneth Kimes, bringing an end to their criminal reign. They broke the psychological chains binding Kenneth to the mother. It did do that, but this story is more than just courtroom drama. I think that we like to close the book, shut the courtroom doors, and walk away. But we really didn't figure this out. This case was not figured out. Kenneth never got to be his true self. We don't ever try this. We don't talk about this. Doesn't he deserve the chance to be someone in the world? Some say he does. Others say he is now changed. He is a criminal. He can never be normal. That's what some say. What do you say? What if it happened to you? And you were thinking, I would never have killed that person if I wasn't in love with this person. It's happening every single day. This case is a very chilling reminder of how powerful influence can be and how it's just too hard to escape it once you're under the spell. This is how it goes out there for some. If you know someone who is under the influence of another, maybe it's time to step in. Until next time, guys, remember to stay aware of those around you and the power they might wield. This is Alexis Knight, and you've been listening to Under the Influence of another. And that wraps it up. Stay safe out there, guys. You know it. Stay out of trouble. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.